Today's lecture discusses the transition from the United Nations Human Rights Commission to the UN Human Rights Council. In the previous lecture, we discussed some of the major activities of the Human Rights Commission and its history since its creation in 1946. Today we'll talk about the last few years of the Commission's existence and why it was abolished in 2006 and replaced with the Human Rights Council. Specifically, we'll focus on the politicization of the Human Rights Commission during the early years of the 21st century, and that will set the stage for the creation of the Human Rights Council, which has some different institutional features than the Commission. Let's start with some of the problems or issues of concern that led to criticisms of the Council in the early 2000s. And I would say there were two criticisms overall. The first was the election to the Commission of states that were widely acknowledged as having quite poor human rights records. I've listed some of those for you on the slide. And the second was that the Commission's work was tainted by political bias. Bias because states were seeking election to the Council to protect themselves and their allies rather than to meaningfully engage in reviewing human rights violations. Second, that the Commission disproportionately focused on some countries and ignored human rights situations that were quite serious in others. And third, that the United States was voted off the Commission for the first time since its creation after the founding of the United Nations in 2001. So some of the concerns that were expressed related to a loss of legitimacy of the Council among different constituencies, among states, for example, and you see a quote here from the United States in 2005, and also a loss of legitimacy among non-state actors or NGOs, and here you see a quite pointed quote from the NGO Human Rights Watch. So these were really quite significant concerns. They were taken quite seriously both by member states, by civil society, and by the bureaucracy of the United Nations itself. And in the mid-2000s, there were a number of important United Nations reports which served as catalysts for institutional reform and the change of the Commission to the Council. The first report in 2004 was from a high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change convened by the Secretary General for addressing a variety of new circumstances in the early 21st century. And one of the panel's recommendations was to upgrade the Commission to become a Human Rights Council, a new United Nations charter body. So it would have a slightly more elevated status than the Commission. This idea was further reinforced in a 2005 report from then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, in which he argued that the Council should have a smaller composition, fewer member states, and that all of its members should abide by the highest standards. 1 year after the Secretary General's report, in 2006, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 60/251, which abolished the Commission and established the Human Rights Council. Now, the Council's membership was not much smaller than that of the Commission, 47 countries rather than the Commission's 53. As with the Commission, these members were to be distributed according to geographic region, but membership rules were quite different. So members would be elected by a majority vote of the General Assembly, and they would be elected for one 3-year term that could be renewed once, and then after that they would need to take a break from membership. That was not the case under the Commission. In addition, for the first time, the General Assembly was authorized by this resolution to suspend members who themselves had engaged in gross and systematic violations of human rights. So this was thought of as being partially a check on the election of members who had poor human rights records. Now, a number of other substantive guidelines and monitoring structures were also established in this General Assembly resolution. So first there was a commitment, at least in principle, that the Council's work would operate under the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. This does seem like a bit too many synonyms for the same general point, but the idea was to try to reinforce, to underline the idea that the Council would not pick and choose among which countries human rights practices to review, but would in fact consider all of them at least in an equivalent way. And part of the way that the Council would do that is by requiring, or by encouraging, I should say, those states seeking election to the Council to make voluntary pledges and commitments relating to human rights. And those voluntary pledges and commitments, in turn, would be part of a new review procedure known as Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, in which the human rights obligations of every member state of the United Nations would be reviewed in a fairly standard sequence. So at least once every several years, every UN member state would be reviewed, and those who were serving on the Council would also be reviewed for the pledges that they had made. So this gives you a sense of at least some of the potential reforms of the Council. We'll discuss the Council's activities in greater detail in the next lecture. For now, I want to show you the meeting room of the UN Human Rights Council at UN headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, and you can get a sense of the institution by the architecture, if you will, of this room. It's quite a grand space. The members of the Commission are seated in the inner rings of the meeting room space. Other member states of the UN sit around the outer rings, and members of civil society participate from the sidelines, although they can testify before the Council if they are in fact asked to do so. For those of you interested in additional information about the transition from the Commission to the Council, I suggest that you consult some of the resources that you see on the slide before you, which are available in the external links page of the Coursera website.